Welcome to Chapter 24 and the immune system. This starts on page 518 of your textbook, and that's already like a page into Chapter 24, which is actually called the body's defenses. So we're going to be looking at how we protect ourselves from invaders. So what do enemies look like? We have a lot out there, and bacteria, I'm sure you've heard of Pseudomonas, fungi, protozoans, worms, those tapeworms, viruses, and cancer cells. All of those are some type of organism that can enter our body and cause us to get sick or die. So how do we protect ourselves? There are three lines of defense. Sort of think of it as a war. And we need to protect ourselves. That is the first line of defense. You prevent the invader from entering at all. So that is an external barrier that prevents anything from entering. The second line of defense is also called the innate defenses, and this is a reaction to an invader. So the invader can be anything. It doesn't matter what it is. It's going to try to stop it. So different parts of the body are going to come into action and be called upon to eliminate the invader. And then finally, the third line of defense, which is called adaptive immunity. This is the specific line of defense. This takes time to get activated. It's not the first line of defense. Our invaders have to go through each line. So if they break through the first, then the second becomes active. If they break through the second, then the third line. And that is the specific fighters. They will go after an enemy. That does take them time to figure out who the enemy is. And that's why it takes time, because they've got to find the enemy and eventually set up a war to destroy it. And it's not the first system involved. We will be talking about all three of these, especially the second and third, in quite a bit of detail. The third line is actually the immune system. So here is a picture showing the body's defenses. The two on the left, the two columns, innate defenses, they operate whether or not we've been exposed previously to the same pathogen. The pathogen is an invader. So the column on the left, the far left, that is your first line of defense. This is external defenses, so that the invader cannot enter. Our skin, secretions such as hydrochloric acid, saliva, tears in your eyes, the mucous membranes that line our trachea, they help trap anything that's entering our body, particulate matter that you've read about, and smoke, or bacteria and viruses that may be in the air. When somebody sneezes, the amount of spread of that spray goes across a room. Then the second line of defense is the internal innate defenses. And there are several different cells involved, because now we're looking at internal. The invader has invaded, and now our body is trying to eliminate it before it can cause any damage to you. So the first cell that's active are phagocytic cells. They're white blood cells that travel through tissue and engulf the invader. They actually can bend, twist, turn through your tissues, and this is all because of the cytoskeleton of the white blood cells. Natural killer cells are specifically designed to kill, and that's exactly what they do. Defensive proteins, we have many proteins in our body that help to protect us, and we will look at them in more detail in a little bit. And then the inflammatory response. This is something that happens all the time. Anytime you have an itis condition, bronchitis, tonsillitis, sinusitis, all of those are inflammatory responses. And our body is responding, trying to get us healthy. And it happens if you sprain your ankle. Your ankle gets hot, red, swollen, and painful. And that is the inflammatory response trying to heal tissue. When you sprain an ankle, even though you don't have an open wound, you do have damaged tissue, which is now something that your body's going to try to heal. And then we also have adaptive defenses, and this is the third line of defense. And this is where we're looking at antibodies and lymphocytes. Those are leukocytes, or white blood cells, and they're one white blood cell that you were able to see underneath the microscope. It was a larger cell that had a large round nucleus in it, and you couldn't differentiate B and T cells, but there are two different kinds of lymphocytes, and you can see what they look like in the picture here. And those are our immune system cells. And then the part on the bottom that covers both the second line and the third line is the lymphatic system. Now that is a system, just like the circulatory system. We're not going into huge detail on it, but it's very similar to the circulatory system. Doesn't carry blood, it has lymph fluid, but it's tied real closely to the circulatory system, picks up fluid and water that the circulatory system doesn't pick up, but eventually it dumps or drains any of the extra fluids into your circulation so they can be eliminated. They're also where white blood cells sit and wait to protect you. So the first line of defense, if you look on your textbook at 518, it talks about the external innate defenses. And this is the first barrier that the invader has to beat. And we have three different types: physical, mechanical, and chemical. The physical is our skin. If we have healthy skin with no open wounds, we're not going to get an invader through our skin. It's the same as the linings of our body. The stomach, if we don't have an open wound in our stomach, like an ulcer, no bacteria can enter. But if you have an ulcer, that's an open wound. Even though you don't see it, it's inside your body. And the physical barrier of your tissues are not functioning. Mechanical barriers. Now, those are similar to our mucus. It is sticky. It's secreted all along the trachea, and it picks up bacteria that you may have breathed in. The ciliated cells, the cilia sweep back and forth and trap tissue, things that may have been brought in with your breathing. So cilia are very, very important. And then a flushing action of urination and diarrhea. Both of those are eliminating bacteria that may have invaded. And then finally, chemical barriers. Those are secretions that we have, like hydrochloric acid, our tears in our eyes, those are a chemical barrier. So all of those are different ways or methods. That is the first line of defense. Now the second line of defense is still not for a specific invader. It doesn't matter what's entered. If the first line of defense is broken through, this second line of defense is going to stop whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is. So it's considered non-specific. It's also innate. These are defenses that are already present and act whether the invader has been previously encountered or not. So some of the cells that are involved with this in this non-specific defense are phagocytes and natural killer cells, which are white blood cells. Phagocytes are cells like neutrophils and macrophages. Both of those white blood cells are capable of traveling through tissue using the cytoskeleton, and they weave their way through to get to where they need to engulf the invader or damaged tissue or whatever it is that they need to clean up. Antimicrobial proteins, these are in your blood and tissue fluids, and they come into play during this second line of defense. And then the inflammatory response. That is a typical response that occurs the same way every time it happens. Now we have, I have slides on each of these, and we will look at them in a little more detail on the next 6 to 7 slides. And then I'm going to stop this part of the presentation and start with a new presentation for the third line of defense. So internal innate defenses. This is a chart that shows what is internal and innate. The white blood cells includes the phagocytic cells, which engulf the invader, or natural killer cells, which actually just go out and kill or destroy. You can sort of think of them as the armed guard with the gun. They're just going to kill. They don't care what it is. Defensive proteins, on the other hand, are two different types. Interferons. These protect you against a viral infection, and I have a little slide that shows how they work. And complement proteins, which are actually a cascade of like 20 different proteins in your body, and they actually cause an invading cell to lyse itself, which is kill itself. So here's a picture of the phagocytes, and you can see on the right the extensions coming out from the macrophage and the bacteria. So they wander throughout the area. Okay, then the next set is the neutrophil, which is also a phagocytic cell. So both the macrophages and the neutrophils are capable of doing phagocytosis. They both go after debris and invaders in the second line of defense, so it doesn't really matter what they are. And then eosinophils are also phagocytic, but they're not the main players in day-to-day unless you come across a parasitic worm. Now this is showing how interferon works, and on the left is a virus-infected cell. So it's a cell inside your body that the virus has entered. So that cell releases interferon, and the interferon interacts with the healthy cell and the self-markers that you have on your cells, and in turn it causes the healthy cell to make antiviral proteins, and in turn it eliminates the virus. Then we have natural killer cells. They're basically killer cells. They find their target cell, attach to it, and spit in their chemicals that in turn enhance the inflammatory response or kill the cell. Then complement. You have 20 different proteins, and it causes the cell to open up and allow water to come into the cell. And once the water gets inside the cell bursts. And then here is the inflammatory response. And this is a response that occurs the same way every time it occurs. It's very typical. It's got a very specific pattern that it follows. But here you can see there is a skin injury, and it looks like a splinter or something entered the skin, and in turn there are chemicals released, and histamine is one of those signals that allows the blood vessels to become leaky and open up the holes or spaces so that the white blood cells can leave the circulation and travel up to the site of injury. In turn, the phagocytic cells engulf the bacteria and the cell debris, and the tissue will heal. But during that time, there's swelling, there's heat because of the extra blood to the area, and the swelling is due to the extra fluid brought by the dilation of the blood vessels. It's red because of the extra circulation. So usually when you have something like this, you use ice on it, you elevate it, you compress it, and rest it. It's called RICE. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. And then finally, here's a picture of the lymphatic system. And you have several organs that belong to the lymphatic system. Your tonsils, you have lymph nodes throughout your body. Often you will recognize that you have lymph nodes in your neck when you're sick and the doctor presses on them because they swell up. You have extra white blood cells that get released and cause your lymph nodes to swell up. The thymus gland, which is in front of your breastbone or sternum. The spleen. They also include the appendix. Inside the lymphatic vessels is lymph, and it's a watery fluid. It's very similar to the interstitial fluid that is all around the different cells, and it picks up extra fluid that the circulation may not have picked up, and it does return it to the circulatory system. There are actually two sections up by the arms where they attach to the circulatory system and dump the fluid into the circulatory system.